Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. We're pleased to have Media Research Center's Julia Seymour with us today.
She is with the Business Media Institute, and we're going to focus on the reporting and the activities surrounding the economic disaster that is the city of Detroit. They have filed a bankruptcy. There's all kinds of history to this, but ongoing, the biggest municipal bankruptcy in the history of the United States. Our topic of focus today, the Florida Roundtable begins following these messages.
WHDO 38. Are you tough enough?
Tough TV is the first digital broadcast network to offer first-run original programming targeted at men. Tough TV features content that men are passionate about. Sports, lifestyle, drama, reality, talk, specials, and movies. Visit us online at toughtv.com. Are you tough enough?
Catch Tough TV on WHDO 38 in Orlando and check us out online at toughtv38.com. Watch us today.
This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. So good to be here with you again, Reagan, and hello to all of our listeners.
Always a pleasure to share these quarters with you, Al. And before we get started today, as usual, we do want to remind folks about myflanews.com.
When you go to myflanews.com, I think it's the best website on the web. What do you think, Reagan?
Oh, well, we may be a little biased, but it is excellent. It certainly is, yes.
We are completely biased.
And we admit that up front.
And we admit it, so at least you know what you're getting.
Yeah.
You can get up to date on the news, however, on myflanews.com is not biased. It's actually wonderful journalism.
That's right.
And this is a commentary show, as you know. So you can go to myflanews.com, get up to date with the latest stories affecting Florida and affecting you, and you can also listen to archive shows of your favorite show and mine and Reagan's Florida Roundtable.
There it is. That's it. All right. Well, Al, lots of things going on in this busy world of ours, and you've got a couple of observations on Florida politics.
We have some repercussions continuing from the Trayvon Martin case and the exoneration of Mr. Zimmerman. Of course, this story is far from done because there's going to be a civil suit, I'm sure, and a civil trial, and he may still be found guilty of causing, he did cause the death of Trayvon Martin, but he may be found culpable and therefore liable. But of course, we have Jesse Jackson, who always provides a modicum of entertainment to shows like ours. He is calling Florida the apartheid state.
Okay.
I think he likes to rhyme a lot, too, so that's probably part of the way he's calling it the apartheid state. Now, Senator Marco Rubio is not really happy about that. So he is giving a hand slap to Jesse Jackson, saying that, here's the quote, "I think Jesse Jackson, unfortunately, has a long history of making outrageous comments, and the only thing sadder than those comments is the fact that people still pay attention to some of them." He was on Fox News' Your World with Neil Cavuto. I think people that live in Florida or have visited Florida know how outrageous those comments are. I remember when Jesse Jackson ran for president in 1988. Do you remember that?
Well, I certainly do.
And he was derailed by comments he made about New York, calling it, quote-unquote, Hymietown, using a derogatory reference to Jewish people.
Yep. And
that didn't fly very well, especially since Jewish people helped African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement. So I thought that was quite interesting.
It's hard to say this, and he's been colorful and he's been involved over the years, but maybe it's time to retire. Did you ever think about that?
Jesse Jackson is never retiring. Neither is Pat Robertson. That's another guy who's a little bit cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm with you 100%. I was going to go and mention, even though it's been several days now, some people may not have heard about it. George Zimmerman was cited in Texas where he got a speeding ticket.
That's very interesting. I didn't know about that.
Okay.
Here's another story that's kind of weird. Miami Cubans are being accused of plotting President Maduro's assassination. Who is President Maduro? He is the current president of Venezuela. He's in the same line as, I guess, the former president who passed away, Hugo Chavez. So we have allegations by Venezuelan officials accusing members of Miami's Cuban exile community and former CIA agent Luis Posada Carillas of plotting to assassinate Nicolas Maduro. Very interesting, don't you think, Reagan?
I do, and I have talked to some Venezuelans in Central Florida who make no bones about it that this guy Maduro is just a flat-out communist.
Right.
And they don't like him. So
it kind of reminds you of the 1960s again with the CIA plots that we're going to use Miami Cubans and then use Miami Cubans to invade Cuba. You remember that?
The Bay of Pigs. Yes. Jack Kennedy's, the biggest disaster of Jack Kennedy's presidency.
Very much so. Yeah. So it sounds like the more times change, the more they don't.
Looking at what's in the rearview mirror to see what's behind us. All right. Well, let us pause along the network line. We'll remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
We will be joined by Julia Seymour of the Business Media Institute in Washington, D.C. as the conversation continues.
Does being over 40 make you feel like half the man you used to be? Introducing Ageless Male, a life-changing supplement for men
tested to help increase testosterone levels.
With over 15 million tablets sold, you owe it to yourself to find out what Ageless Male can do for you. If you would like to experience what taking Ageless Male can feel like,
get Ageless Male now, risk-free.
We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we presume you know who you are, and we thank you for the pleasure of your company. And Al, at this point in the program, we are joined by Julia Seymour from the Media Research Center. And Julia, welcome to the Florida Roundtable.
Thank you. It's great to be talking with you today.
Before we get started here, I want to ask you to go ahead and take the first minute. You know, I can sit here and read your credentials and whatnot, but why don't you go ahead and take a minute or so and just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background and education, and what you do down there in Washington.
Sure. I work for the Media Research Center's Business and Media Institute. I've been here almost 7 years. And the Media Research Center serves as a watchdog over the news media. We expose liberal media bias. I specifically focus on business and economic issues for the Business and Media Institute. It's something I really enjoy doing. Before that, I actually got a degree in journalism and graduated from Liberty University in Central Virginia. So I know how I was trained to do journalism, and so that's the perspective I bring to stories of knowing how a journalist is supposed to report things. I look at stories and see when they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing or messing things up.
I have a question, playing devil's advocate,
Sure.
Of course. Is there ever any such a thing as conservative media bias? I always hear the term liberal media bias. But what about from the other side? Do you think there's any of that going on?
I'm sure that it could exist. The reason we're a conservative organization, we make no bones about that, and I think that it's perfectly fair to criticize liberal media bias if we're honest about where we're coming from.
No, don't get me wrong. I'm saying that's fine too, but I'm thinking that there's bias along multiple lines. You see what I mean? Whereas journalism, as you know, because I studied some journalism too, should be as down the middle as possible, right?
Yeah, it's supposed to be objective. The problem is, generally it isn't, one way or the other. But when we're looking at national media outlets, most of them skew in the liberal direction.
About 99% of them, I think.
I think that quite a few. And, some would say Fox News does the other, and that's more conservative leaning. So I agree with you, though. I think that news should be objective. Reagan and I come from that retro idea that journalism should actually be delivered in an impartial way, and that commentary should be listed as such.
When's the last time you actually saw a television station that proudly displayed the seal of approval, the seal of the National Association of Broadcasters, proudly, as we used to say at Storer Broadcasting, on their television stations? And there was an NAB code of ethics, which I haven't heard about in years. So
I don't even know the seal you're referring to. It's been probably so long since I've seen one. What about you, Julia?
I'm not familiar with that, although my training is more along the print lines, and so I'm very familiar with the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, and it's something we actually bring up fairly often here in the analysis we do of the media coverage, particularly when they're, going to biased experts, or they're not admitting that they might have, not examine things fully, or there's an agenda behind something.
Well, what comes to mind most recently in the last year as far as bias is the NBC editing the Zimmerman 911 tape to make it look like he was asking about the person's color. It made it seem like he was racist right off the bat, along with the various photos that were shown of Zimmerman and a very young Trayvon Martin. It's very much designed to skew the opinions of people watching. You could say propagandistically, I would think.
Well, that selective edit, that was just disgraceful behavior on the part of NBC, and something that the Media Research Center sought to expose and railed against. It was so awful, and it had, a very real impact on the coverage of the case, and it influenced so many people prejudicially from the very outset. It was awful.
And then you could also, if you take us back, let's go back about 11 years, the war drums beating for invading Iraq. Remember, every media outlet, including Fox, including NBC, including the big three, were talking about how horrible Saddam Hussein was and these weapons of mass destruction that were never found, and beat the war drums until everyone was foaming at the mouth. And anyone that even criticized President Bush at the time, let's take the Dixie Chicks, for example, were excoriated in the media. Do you remember that?
That's a little bit before I was analyzing media.
Yeah.
I was probably early in my college career or late high school.
But you recall what was going on. In other words,
I remember. A little bit, but not enough to give any sort of expert commentary.
I got you. You're young then. You must be 25, 26, or.
I'm a little older than that.
Okay, all right. Well, good. We like the young viewer. We like the young opinion, right?
Well, the purpose of our conversation here today, before we get lost, the city of Detroit, saving Detroit from itself. Let me offer a notion here, because boy, we sure heard from the pension holders and the AFL-CIO. And obviously there is another side to this story, and I'm the history of this thing. The most major Civil Rights Act comes along in the Lyndon Johnson years, and far-reaching and promising all kinds of things. And by 1967, the black population isn't seeing it, and so there are riots all over the country. And one of the biggest and worst is in the city of Detroit in 1967. Then by 1973, they elect a labor organizer by the name of Coleman Young to be the mayor, and he's going to be in office for 20 years. And Julia, from a business standpoint, I would trace the roots of this bankruptcy and this problem back to people like Coleman Young.
You could certainly be right. I mean, I think Detroit had a lot of problems that have all worked together to bring them to the point that they are in now. Population decline is a huge part of that. They've lost, since 1950, their population has dropped from 1.85 million people, to roughly around 700,000. That's a huge decline in population. And why did this happen? There are a number of reasons. Economist Art Laffer wrote about this recently, saying that, there are a number of things going on here. First of all, we have an economic recovery that's not recovering very well right now. So the national economy is impacting Detroit. But moving that backwards, Detroit is part of Michigan, which in 10 years has seen the lowest population growth in the country, high tax rates that have contributed to the decline. And then Detroit itself has high costs, lack of benefits. I mean, public services there are a disaster. And all of these things have contributed, not to mention government corruption, which has been a huge problem in Detroit.
Reagan brings up a very good point. You could say one of the big turning points were the black riots. And, Detroit started to get a reputation as a dangerous city. You had, quote-unquote, white flight, right? And this happened in many cities where people were moving to the suburbs, the inner cities became degraded. New York City, for example, I remember growing up in New York in the 70s. There's a turnaround in New York, of course, but that didn't happen in Detroit. In Detroit, because of the manufacturing base, which left because of the influx of foreign vehicles and the outflux of manufacturing jobs, and basically a lot of car companies and related industries closing, you lost your tax rolls, you lost your tax base. So you had a loss of population. You had people leaving because there were no more jobs. You had the tax base. Would you say all this contributed as well?
Absolutely. It's all of those things put together. And part of the reason that the manufacturing left is because they couldn't compete in a world economy. And that has a lot to do with, the unions, the power there in the auto industry forced the companies to pay much higher wages and benefits than they would be able to pay elsewhere, and so eventually they saw it. Well, we can't do this. We have to leave. But all of it factors in, absolutely.
Our local politicians through those years bought the union support by making very generous labor agreements. Pensions are sweetened not only for the next term, but retroactively. They go back and say, we're going to make it better. And if there was a good investment year, retirement funds issued bonus checks. Well, all of a sudden, things are, and here comes Volkswagen and Nissan and all of the other foreign imports, and Detroit sits there and pretends like they're not happening, and they're giving away the farm.
Yeah, they went into a period of denial. That's very true. I definitely I think Detroit is really an example of what's happening in America. It's really something, in my opinion, I wanted to get your opinion, of course, that's happening in towns across America. You go to towns and they're shells of their former selves because the jobs are going, and the jobs are going to China, and the jobs are going to India, and the jobs are going across the world. And well, if you don't have jobs, you don't have tax rolls, you have decay, you have infrastructure destruction, you have people leaving, and so really I see this happening more and more in various communities. What do you see happening?
Well, I don't want to put the blame entirely on outsourcing or foreign competition. I think that's not quite accurate. Those things are playing a role, but we should be able to adapt to them, and it's, I think, government interventionism that often prevents that from happening. When I look at Detroit, when I think about Detroit, I see it as the very picture of what happens when liberal economic policies go unabated. They had the unions, which are very much supported by the left. They were very strong. They made cars in a way that was not cost effective, and eventually that came crashing down. And you're right to say that the pensions, which kept getting sweetened retroactively by the government, that's just ludicrous. And the problem is, you can't solve population decline by taxing the remaining people higher in order to pay those people. It just doesn't work. And so all of these things have worked together, and it became this like vicious cycle in Detroit, where people left, So they had, they keep trying to tax the base that's there, but the base is leaving because the taxes are too high, and they can't get a job there.
Before we go to our break here, I want one quick point. People say, why Detroit? Why are you picking on Detroit? Now, I have heard, and you would know better whether this is accurate or not, but this bankruptcy filing is the biggest municipal bankruptcy filing in the history of the United States, so I have heard.
I believe that is correct. Let me double check.
I know that we had the county in Alabama.
It's the largest municipal bankruptcy in history. Yes, it is Reagan.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, now you know why we're talking about. Julia, we do need to take a pause along our network line here. Let us remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest, Julia Seymour from the Business Media Institute in Washington, D.C. We are discussing the bankruptcy and the import and the wheres and whys there of the city of Detroit, and our conversation continues following these messages.
Blackheads, so not attractive and so hard to get rid of. Wish you could make those stubborn blackheads disappear? Now you can with the brand new Blackhead Dissolving Gel from Proactive. And the best news of all, it's free when you order Proactive in the next 10 minutes.
I'm in love with the Blackhead Dissolving Gel. It took a week and I could already just tell my blackheads were diminishing.
Unlike scrubs that only treat the surface of your skin, the dissolving gel penetrates deep down to melt away the dirt, grime, and oil trapped within your pores.
The Blackhead Dissolving Gel is really awesome. When I look in the mirror, instead of having black little needle points in my pores, it's just clear. It's just my skin.
Call the number on your screen now to order Proactive for just $19.95, and we'll rush you the dissolving gel free.
Now after using Proactive, I just feel confident in myself and I feel beautiful.
Don't miss out. Get all this, an $85 value for just $19.95. Now that's a deal. Call the number on your screen now.
From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And our very special guest this day, Julia Seymour with the Business Media Institute, the Media Research Center in Washington, D.C. Julia, thank you for being with us this day. Our topic of conversation, the biggest municipal bankruptcy in history, filed by the city of Detroit. They're not alone in their financial problems, but they paint a rather frightening picture. And, of course, we hear, oh, well, the federal bailout. We got to have a federal the feds can save the city of Detroit. And I would say, well, hold on a moment. Detroit has already been getting, I would call it a rolling bailout, if you will, $228 million in federal grants last year and $137 million from the state of Michigan. And yet they've got a tax rate that's 50% higher than the neighboring city of Dearborn, and all that money's gone. All this federal and state money coming in, and they're squandering all of it.
It almost sounds like the big banks, Reagan.
Well, I don't see any difference. I really don't.
I don't either.
Julia, your notion on that what about a federal bailout?
I say no, and I'll get into that in just a minute. You asked me a few minutes ago, though, why I'm picking on Detroit. And I don't mean to pick on Detroit, but I think that we need to look at what's going on and the fact that they want to go into bankruptcy because people are talking about a bailout. Because if a bailout happens, that sends a very clear signal to other cities in financial troubles that they could be bailed out too.
Bingo, exactly.
That's why we're looking at this. That's why we have to talk about it, and why we need to realistically assess what's gone wrong in Detroit, so that maybe there can be, some sort of solution. But as far as a bailout goes, absolutely not. Bailouts present a terrible. They incentivize bad behavior. It's called moral hazard.
Yes.
And so we, as proponents of free market economics here at the Business and Media Institute, we oppose this plan and all bailouts because of that.
I concur because you're right. When you bail out banks, when you bail out companies, when you bail out cities, when you bail out anybody or anything, you're basically saying, oh, this is the safety net. So other people, you go ahead and have some bad behavior, and we're going to take care of it because we're the federal government. And of course, it increases federal power and influence, and it decreases politics on a local level and strengthens companies. So it's a bad idea. It really is. And I personally, I'm a bit torn when it came to when they bailed out the auto industry, because I saw the auto industry completely going away, and it's good in the short term, but is it really good in the long term? That's really the question. I mean, sometimes it when the banks were bailed out, everyone said, how could you bail out the banks? Well, can you prevent financial collapse? But of course, the banks, it gives them the opportunity to keep doing the bad behavior. The car companies too. It's not that sometimes these things, it's like the bitter pill you have to take sometimes, I guess, right?
Well, that's certainly the argument. I still thought that those bailouts were a bad idea, but ultimately they happened. And it's hard to say what would have happened had they not been bailed out, because you can't really prove how history would have gone had you taken the other path.
Right.
But Detroit is a government that has tried to tax and overspend their way for years, and the problem has only gotten worse. If Detroit were a business, it would have two options: go out of business or reinvent itself. The problem is Detroit is a city, and so it's trying to look to taxpayers to save it, and if it can't find enough state or city taxpayers, it's going to want a federal bailout, which means that all the people who left Detroit because of how bad it was end up getting punished along with everyone else if the feds agree and try to bail them out.
So obviously you think the bankruptcy is a good idea because it gives them a fresh start.
Well, I am not a bankruptcy expert, but I think, if legally they're allowed to do that, that could be a solution. I'm not an expert in that. I'm an expert in the media, and actually I'd like to get to talking about how the media have covered Detroit when you guys are, ready for that.
We are ready.
Let me just make one comment here, and that goes to what you just said, Julia. This has been going on for decades, and the city went to the taxpayers, they went to the capital markets to finance all this pension business, and guess what? They're all tapped out now. And so here we are. There is no such thing as a free pension. Somebody's got to put the money up from somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Now, media coverage. Probably with the exception of the Wall Street Journal. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Leah, let's talk about it.
Before I tell you what the media has said, I want to tell you a little bit about what we know about Detroit. Did you know, I didn't know this until recently, that Devil's Night is so famously celebrated there, which is October 30th, and there is so much arson in the city of Detroit on Devil's Night that it's become a pop culture reference. It crops up in movies and television shows like NCIS, Criminal Minds, and a number of movies. The wait times for police to show up after an emergency call can be an hour to many hours. Last year, my Fox Detroit reporter timed it, and it took 4 hours for the police to show up after a home invasion call. City services are abysmal. So all of this is what it really looks like if you're living in Detroit.
Now we know why people are leaving.
Exactly. So this is important because the media has painted a completely different picture in the year leading up to Detroit's bankruptcy filings. They barely discussed the major fiscal crisis facing Detroit, and instead it seems like they bought into that Super Bowl commercial from 2012 that Eminem, the rapper, was in, that portrayed the city as tough and strong and staging a comeback. But really, the network should know better than to fall for an ad campaign. Instead, what they've done is wear rose-colored glasses when they're talking about the Motor City, and they've covered positive economic news 6 times more than negative. 12 positive economic stories about Detroit in that year to 2 talking about the problem.
Yeah,
it's just there's obviously a spin going on. It's what's interesting is high taxes don't always lead to flight. It has to be a combination, because look how many taxes people on Long Island pay. I mean, I know personally of someone that pays $20,000 a year just in property taxes. But because there are financial jobs in New York City and there are other related jobs that will support that type of thing, then everything's hunky-dory. People are still clamoring to get to live on Long Island. There's a certain mystique about living there now, and it's the rich playground, of course, and which didn't used to be. It used to be a very middle-class place. And, that's the thing. If you have jobs, I don't think people mind paying higher taxes, Reagan.
Well, I want to go back and tie into that thought, too, that Julia brought up, the advertising.
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is the GM, Ford, and Chrysler are still in decline, despite this federal bailout. And recently there was a huge national advertising campaign. I believe it was Chrysler. Cars going through the city at night, showing that everything is hunky-dory.
Yes.
It's just wonderful.
Yes.
Chrysler. And I don't know, the bailout money's been paid back, I guess, but I hearken back to the late 70s when they thought Chrysler was going to go bankrupt, and the federal government didn't contribute a dime. There was a fellow who'd been fired from Ford that Chrysler went out and found, who saved their collective by the name of Lee Iacocca. American determinism. Have we lost that?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer, unfortunately. But that's the way businesses should do it. If they're struggling, they should go out and find a leader who can bring them back, who can help them figure out where they went wrong and steer them in the right direction. They shouldn't go begging politicians to give them the money that they take from the taxpayers.
Right. That's a very good point, and.
Well, you know what? We are at that point. I'm sorry. We do need to pause again along our network line here. The clock, Julie, sometimes tends to fly on us when we get into these things. But let us remind folks that this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is Julia Seymour with the Business Media Institute at the Media Research Center in Washington, D.C. If you'll stay put, our conversation continues following these messages.
When it's warm, you'd love to open every door and let fresh air into your home. The trouble is, you'd end up letting lots of bugs into your home as well. Now there's Magic Mesh, the new type of screen door that opens easily and then magically closes itself behind you. The secret isn't really magic, it's magnets. 18 magnets to be exact. When you separate them, they automatically snap back together. That makes it great for pets too, because instead of scratching and whining, they can come and go as they please. So let the fresh air in and keep those annoying bugs out with Magic Mesh, a $40 value, yours for just $19.95. But wait, call right now and we'll double the offer. Just pay separate processing and handling. You get 2 Magic Mesh curtains for just $19.95. Don't delay. Call and order yours today.
To order Magic Mesh for $19.95 plus processing and handling, call 1-800-219-1380 or log on to buymagicmesh.com.
We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day, Julia Seymour from the Business Media Institute, the Media Research Center in Washington, D.C. And Julia, thank you so much for spending all of this time with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, a couple of points I think that you want to make sure that we get to before we part company here today, so we're going to let you go ahead with that.
Okay, so I've already mentioned that the way that ABC, CBS, and NBC have covered Detroit in the year leading up to its bankruptcy was overwhelmingly positive, and I just wanted to give you a couple examples of that. They've boasted about a booming auto industry, but as you just mentioned, the GM, Ford, Chrysler are still struggling. You know, they're not going great guns here. You know, they may be having a turnaround from where they were, but that doesn't mean they're doing fantastically. NBC aired 3 separate Making a Difference segments, which are those cheery segments that they put at the end of their broadcast, talking about people who are, like, helping in their communities and things like that. And I realized people like happy stories, but that they found 3 from Detroit in a year that they were ignoring what's really going on there says says volumes about the perception that they want people to have of this particular city. And of course, CBS has also praised, saying that the city was in high gear because of when auto company sales were up, they would talk about that. But they wouldn't really talk about the auto companies when the sales were down. So definitely getting a skewed perspective from the networks here.
And so your job with the Media Research Center is to obviously bring this to the attention of the public.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's what we seek to do here. I particularly end up writing a lot of trend pieces looking at how something's covered over, a longer period of time.
Well, let me ask you this.
What themes there are.
Where do you see Detroit? How do you see this all playing out? Say the bankruptcy goes through, it's allowed, which is still up in the air. Where do you see the city in, say, 5 years? Let's just throw out use our imaginations and put a prediction out. We won't hold you to it, of course, but.
Well, if the bankruptcy goes through, but they don't make any other changes, if they don't reform or change, the way that they're taxing people there, or improve their ability to provide public services, then I don't see why people would want to return to Detroit and make it better. They really need to somehow attract people to their city, and that's something that's going to be very difficult to do with nearly 80,000 abandoned buildings, few city parks, and only I think less than half of their stoplights working.
So you're not sounding very hopeful here on this.
Well, I think it's a monumental task, and as you said, with car companies turning themselves around, it takes the right sort of leadership, and I just don't know if they're going to be able to pull it off. At least 5 years is a really short window, too. I mean, you're saying 5 years.
I'm just saying 5 years. Yeah. I mean, do you see? Yeah,
that's a different story.
Let's just say a generation. Let's say 20 years from now. What do you see in Detroit? Do you see a revived community, or do you see a continuing decaying community?
I am no fortune teller. It really depends on whether they continue to pursue the same failing policies, I think, or whether they reevaluate and change what they're doing.
The city of Detroit needs urgent and committed action. They have the highest violent crime rate in the United States. They have the worst schools. There is blight. There is corruption. And I would submit through the media, if the gloom and doom continues, you have to acknowledge it's there. But, those are the things that shape our attitudes, our behaviors, our actions. And if we expect Detroit to be able to move ahead, they have got to come up with an emerging story of possibility. That notion that there can be a forward-moving path, but that is going to require a sea change in attitude within the government of the city of Detroit.
Do you think that's possible, though, Reagan? You're from up in that area.
I saw it happen in Cleveland years ago, where they threw the rascals out and did get about 12 years. There was a mayor named Ralph Perk, who was followed by a mayor named George Voinovich, who went on to serve a long time in the United States Senate, and Cleveland had a rebirth. And it's not that much different from Detroit. It's only an hour-and-a-half drive.
I'm going to be hopeful and say that Detroit, if they can get the bankruptcy through and lower their debt load, and lower their who they have to, all this stuff, things they have to pay, pensions and so forth. I think, yes, there can be an emergence, a reemergence of Detroit. So I'm going to be positive on it.
And Julia, obviously, we don't know. Do you see that national media and city media there can play a role in this?
Well, the role I would like to see the media playing, whether they be local, state, or national news, is to tell things like they are. If there's reason for hope or people trying to change things, that's a fine story to do. But also being honest about the problems, because being dishonest about the problems or trying to hide them by not covering them doesn't do anyone any good. It doesn't do Detroit any favors to deceive people about what it's like there.
I think that's very well put. And on that note, we'll call a halt to our little conversation here today. But Julia Seymour of the Business Media Institute, Media Research Center, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your observations. They are certainly welcome in these quarters, and from time to time, we'd like to invite you back to do this again.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I do hope we can speak again.
Julia Seymour. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
This is the Florida Roundtable, and we'll be back with a closing thought following these messages.
If you owe more than $10,000 in back taxes, our qualified CPAs, tax negotiators, and support staff know the law and know how to get your situation under control legally and permanently.
Call the number on your screen now, and we will contact the IRS on your behalf. Help you end wage garnishment, stop collection calls, remove tax liens, resolve tax penalties, and reduce the amount you owe if you qualify.
Call now and find out how we can help you resolve your IRS problems.
Call the Tax Resolvers at 800-506-5201.
We are back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And what a pleasure having Julia Seymour with us today from the Business Media Institute. First time appearance on the Florida Roundtable, but I'm hoping it won't be the last.
And I agree with you. She was a
very insightful young lady.
Very smart, very good. Adds some good flavor to the show, as they say.
Yeah.
Here's a disturbing story, in all seriousness. We have a DCF horror story. DCF, the Department of Children and Families. It says here a child sex trafficking victim was raped after going to a Miami safe house. A child sex trafficking victim placed under the care of DCF was raped just days after being sent to a newly opened Miami safe house, CBS 4 News has reported. The safe house quietly closed after the April assault. The child advocates say they are now rethinking their plans to house trafficking victims together in an unsecure group home setting. DCF Regional Administrator Gilda Ferrades says, we need to regroup. We decided not to put any more kids in the safe house until these issues were resolved.
You know, there has been a statewide call, and there's some activity in the legislature and in Tallahassee for revamping the entire DCF setup is just being one big gobbledygook. And so perhaps this will give some added incentive to the folks that have the power in Tallahassee.
It's a highly disturbing story.
Move forward with that.
You know, this is supposed to be a safe house.
Yeah.
That means the children are supposed to be safe.
Well, the story that brought about this call for restructuring was the actual death of a child in DCF care. So, disturbing moments, absolutely. Does this department need to have a good, hard look taken at it? You betcha. Well, it's almost time for us to kind of wrap things up here, Al, but I wanted to take a moment, and sometimes we forget to do this, to say thank you to the folks for staying with us, and also to invite your comments. Got somebody you want to hear? Send us an email. You can go to the website there and send us a note. Let us know what you think. And if you're not up to that, we do still take snail mail here.
And one quick thing. Florida's education commissioner goes bye-bye for some tomfoolery at his previous job.
I have mixed emotions. It's something he did in Indiana a long time ago, but, well, as you say, that's it. That's how it works. So, all right. Well, again, let us say thank you for your time this day. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
We'll see you again in 1 week with another edition of the Florida Roundtable.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.